So one of the things that you talk about in your lectures and keynote speeches is perspective and how a change in perspective is important. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So you want to crack on and give us your...
Well, the reason that it's important to change perspective is because what we're talking about in any training, whether it's resilience training like we do or anything else, physical training, is that it's clearly about growth. And so in any process of growth, you need to move from what you don't know into what you will become to know. Mm-hmm. So that period of working from something known to something unknown often requires a new way of thinking or a new way of acting. And a way that we can access that is to change perspective. And sometimes that happens along the way. But that process can be accelerated by deliberately looking at changing perspective.
Mm-hmm. Are there any helpful principles or techniques that will help people to kind of drill into perspective, kind of methods that people can apply?
So we want to talk particularly about Edward de Bono here. And Edward de Bono is a towering figure. I mean, he is the man that invented the phrase lateral thinking, which is now in the dictionary. And he went through a period of very large profile, and then, as often happens, people then sort of forget about them. And I think that's happened to some extent in that when I talk to business leaders and all sorts of people, often they don't know about Edward de Bono, and that surprises me because his work is so important.
And he's still alive, right? He's still
alive.
When did the lateral thinking, phrase, soundbite come about? Was that...
as we're coming into the 70s.
Right. Okay.
He really pioneered a lot of the new methods of how to do it. And one of the things that he says that actually I've not read in his books mainly, but I've heard him say with his recorded lectures, is how important humour is.
Okay.
And you maybe get a feeling when you're presenting something or you're training whoever you are that there's a usefulness in using humour. And that usefulness is not just that it keeps people's attention, although that's really important as well. It's not just the fact that it creates a good atmosphere, a cooperative atmosphere, which it does as well. Mm-hmm. But he talks about humour as being really the essential part of the human brain.
Right.
And he's talking about problem solving when he says this.
Yeah.
And the reason is because when you hear a joke, what it's doing is it's taking you into a new perspective.
Okay.
So what you expect is going from A to B. You expect that, and then the joke is created asymmetrically when they actually take you to C.
Okay.
I've heard comedians talk about the same thing but use very different language. When they say, when you zig, we zag. So that asymmetric thought, which is logical when you work it through, but it doesn't look like you're going to get there when they start the joke. Because you expect, well, this joke is going here. But then humour's created when it actually goes there.
Yeah.
And then you can see it actually is a logical progression. But that instant asymmetric thought, that change of perspective, is actually what makes you laugh.
Right.
And so that capacity of humans to do that, to be able to be dropped into not a straightforward linear logical progression, is where the humour comes from, the change of perspective. So when I heard that, I thought that is why for so long I felt that the use of humour is so important whenever you are training or trying to push people into realms of understanding that they've not had before.
Yeah. People like to be entertained as well, right? It's a form of entertainment, kind of keeps people's attention, especially when you're delivering talks and that sort of thing too.
But that raises a good question of what is entertainment, partly.
Right.
And perhaps something in entertainment is when you've got a new perspective, you've learned something. Mm-hmm. Not just the simple way that we think about entertainment.
Yeah.
In terms of that change in perspective, I wondered the other day if that isn't the purpose of art. So the artworks, whether it's music or whether it's fine art or whatever it is, sculpture, actually change your perspective when you hear them or look at them.
Yeah, 100%. It kind of changes your state, doesn't it? Music can change the way you feel, and it changes your emotional state depending on what it is too. So that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah. And the quality of that art is dependent on the profundity, the ability of it to really change your perspective. There's so many things with visual art, because visual art can literally give you a new perspective as well. When I think about Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John on the cross, and the way that he has pictured Christ from on top of the cross,
Right.
is one example.
Okay.
When you think about Michelangelo's The Pieta that he did, I think when he was 25, which is ridiculous, but what he did in that was that even though it was a traditional sculpture in Christian art, he had not been happy with the fact that it didn't look in perspective correct. So what he did was he made the Christ figure 3/4 size.
Yeah.
And then it gives you a new perspective when you look at it. And it works on so many levels, because part of the genius of the Pieta is that not only does it look like the Son of God in the arms of his mother, but you see the childlike nature of Christ at the same time. So you see his humanity as well as what we associate with his divinity in one piece of art.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, obviously it doesn't mean that that's easy to do. I mean, you're talking about Michelangelo here, for goodness sake, you know. So he executes it with genuine artistic genius. But the reason that is so, it has such an impact, is because it changes perspective.
Right.
It changes your perspective when you look at it, which is an extraordinary level of skill, I think.
Yeah.
And that spectrum of effective art and maybe not so effective art is represented when I heard somebody say, and I've got no idea who it was, but they said about painting that when they look at a Frans Hals picture, it makes them want to take up painting. But when they look at a Rembrandt, it makes them want to give up and forget all about it.
Right.
Because there's a different level of skill that's demonstrated. Even though Frans Hals, you know, the Laughing Cavalier and whatever, is a tremendous artist, Rembrandt has that ability to punch straight into something emotional, intellectual, which changes your perspective.
Yeah. We're talking about lateral thinking. Are there any kind of areas within business or industry, are there any particular places that lateral thinking is really helpful, that kind of people default to in some places?
Yeah, and not just business, but education, healthcare,
Right.
Combat. And what Edward de Bono talks about is that you do need straightforward logical thinking most of the time.
Right.
And in fact, I think I've told you the story before, but once when I was in an army meeting, somebody said, I think what we need is a bit more thinking out of the box. And the bloke who was chairing the meeting said, stop. Actually, what we need is a bit more thinking inside the box.
Right.
And he was right, because what was needed there was a bit more logical thinking to develop. It wasn't that we needed a new idea.
Yeah.
Didn't need to reinvent the wheel at that point, is an expression that's often used in the army, I know.
Yeah, right, okay.
But there are times when you need a creative solution, a new solution, an innovative solution. And that's the time where the lateral thinking approach is so effective.
So you think it applies in a lot of ways to a lot of creative agencies, whether it's marketing, places like that can use lateral thinking to advertising, perhaps?
Advertising, sales.
Yeah.
And of course, when you're developing new products.
Mm-hmm.
That seems very obvious.
Yeah.
Because by very definition, what you're trying to do is create something new. And to create something new, you can't always run on what you've always done. The parameters of the thought that you've always operated under. Even though that thought will help you, as De Bono says, dig the hole deeper.
Yeah.
But it's not so good at finding new places to dig,
Yeah.
which is what lateral thinking is about. The logical thought is high probability, developing on a single level that you've worked out. The lateral thinking approach is low probability.
Right.
You are going to make loads of things which actually end up not working, but they should inform your process.
Yeah. Are there any good examples of lateral thinking that people would be familiar with? Kind of examples in life that people have used lateral thinking that everyone go, oh right, I didn't realise that was it.
But if you think about gaining a new perspective, even in an area like science, where the scientific method and logical thought is so necessary and has given us so many great things, often the breakthroughs are done laterally.
Yeah.
And the one I think which is, I don't know if it's a mythology or not really, but the one which to me instantly springs to mind is that Isaac Newton, working on physics for all that time, And then we have this story of the fact that his breakthrough was caused when the apple fell on his head. So the point is, at that point, he changed his perspective, even though he'd done all the work, if you like. But to break through into a new understanding, he needed an apple to fall on his head. You also think about Archimedes with the bath and Eureka, and there comes a moment where you have to change perspective to break through into a new area. There's lots of examples of innovations where people have had to think of something in a new way in order to gain it. One of the things which you can say about a fixed wing aircraft, which developed by the Wright brothers and all that sort of stuff. And then how do you get from that to a helicopter? So do you move the wing, if you like, with the aircraft, or do you move the wing through the air like a helicopter does? Yeah. So you can get there logically afterwards, but sometimes it requires a change in perspective in order for you to come up with the new idea. Yeah.
And Bono, so what see, I'd never heard of Edward Bono until recently.
That's my point, isn't it?
So this guy, right? He's got a pretty impressive CV. So he's a physician, right?
Right.
Philosopher. He's an author. And lateral thinking isn't just a kind of a term and an idea that he's put out there. There's courses that where you can learn about lateral thinking, right? So he's actually got kind of things out there where people.
I think one of his main innovations is that creativity and creative thinking can be taught.
Yeah. Okay.
Accepting that, of course, that you're always going to get some individuals which are crazy creative, but it can be taught as a discipline. Yeah. And that only comes, as we know, when you've broken down the meta, when you've broken down the strategy of how you actually get there. And that to me is his huge contribution. So he talks about the fact that the Greek gang in Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, they were after the truth, in inverted commas. So they built a way of dialectic method of arguing back and forth, where you can build, okay, so we accept that, so that means we can go on to this. And that's great. But actually to do the lateral thinking, you need a different process than that, because that will run you along rails which you can't then jump out of and then break into something new. Yeah. So it's a criticism in a way, but it's not saying we don't need that type of thinking. We need that type of thinking the majority of the time. Yeah. To run our everyday lives, run our businesses, run all sorts of things. But when something new and creative is required, perhaps we can teach a slightly different method, of which he has a number of methods, in order to produce something creative.
Right. And specific to the sort of talks and workshops that we run, when you're delivering them talks, what kind of perspective changing stuff do you tend to focus on that has the biggest impact from the feedback that we've had?
Yeah. So the reason that I stick with military examples a lot of the time is so that the particularly the business people listening, they can't already assume their knowledge of what they know, because they've probably got a huge bank of knowledge on the particular business environment they're in. Yeah. And what I'd like them to do is think about the principle rather than the technique, if you like, or their specific knowledge on that area. So by jumping out of a business example and using a combat example, that forces people to think in a slightly different way than they're used to. Yeah. And then the trick, as always, is to reapply it back to business when we get to the end. Yeah. So now we've injected a different way of thinking, with you not being able to use your already assumed knowledge, which has put you in a certain lane. Yeah. Now jump back and have a look at it. Edward de Bono again is somebody who says that if you're stuck on a problem that you can't solve, if you put it aside for one moment and instead go and work on a different problem of equal difficulty, often when you come to the original problem, you've got a solution, because you've changed your perspective. You get stuck in a certain way of thinking, and sometimes it's useful to then jump out of it in order to get a completely new idea on it. And then when you've made that idea, you realise that it was logical all along. Right. But it didn't mean that you could necessarily get to it initially through a purely logical method.
Yeah. And there must be some kind of certain personalities within people that struggle with lateral thinking, right? What are they? Are there any people that tend to really battle with it? It's just not something that they kind of...
Yeah. I mean, I think if you look at creative people generally, they're often people who have a kind of natural inclination to work against the status quo, against what's accepted. And that has its good points and its bad points. Yeah. But certainly when it comes to coming up with new ideas, that kind of desire to challenge the status quo, almost to look at it critically and almost assume that you can do something different. But it's not doing something different for the sake of doing something different. It can only be if it adds value. And that really is the acid test of a creative thought. As Edward de Bono says, it's does it add value? If it's just different for being different, then it probably doesn't have any utility.
Right, okay. In terms of any tips or any perspective changing methods that you would recommend that people listening or watching could use in daily life? I know we talk about know yourself, know the battleground, know the enemy and our stuff. Are there any kind of takeaways that people could have a little bit of a think about themselves, perhaps, that would be of use? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's so difficult is gaining a new perspective on yourself, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is why Gurdjieff, for example, whose works are very influential in the training that I do, he talked about the fact that as humans we're unable to see our habitual behaviour. You can kind of understand that. And that's why when you're learning something, you need an instructor. That's why you need an instructor. That's why you'll only ever get so far teaching yourself, because you're unable to see your habitual behaviour. Even take it to a simple thing like learning a physical skill. You're unable to see the habits that you've picked up. So you need an instructor, an outside viewer, to be able to help you with that. And what that outside viewer can do is provoke as well. Not by that I mean wind you up. Although I know some instructors have that approach, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But provoke you into ways of thinking about your habitual behaviour, so that you can change it and create habits which are more beneficial. Now, the hypnotherapy things that I studied is all about breaking habits and putting new habits in. And that's why you need the instructor or the second person or the helper. It's really what in business a mentor should be doing, is to pick out your habitual behaviour and give you an idea about where you can perhaps alter your behaviour.
But it's a lot easier to see faults in other people, right? When you've quite often got the same faults yourself, but you just don't, you're not kind of looking in that reflection.
The instructor needs an instructor themselves. For that reason. And it shouldn't be something that the work of knowing yourself, because it's couched in terms which puts it on you, makes it sound like you're the only person who can do it. No. I mean, you need sincere friends, trusted friends who can really help you with how you might be. You've probably had that experience where somebody reacts to something you've done in a way that you didn't expect. And they said, "Oh, you were like this then." Was I? Particularly in my own past, people said, "God, you're really intense then. Almost like angry." Well, was I? You didn't realise that's actually how you were in, because you were running on that rail of emotion maybe at that point. And then when we look back on it, our ability to record ourselves to honestly is so poor as human beings. And often you speak to somebody about an event that you were both at and you remember it very, very differently. I mentioned this in my book about typically we cast ourselves as the hero because we're self-centered. Everybody generally is quite self-centered. When we may well not have been the hero. We may have been bang out of order. And it takes maybe a trusted friend, a sincere friend, to say, do you know what? Actually, you were bang out of order then for this reason. And then, the right response is to take it in rather than coming back with an ego response of, no, it wasn't. It doesn't mean you've got to listen to everybody. I mean, you listen to trusted friends, sincere friends. So that in your knowledge is very important. But it's also important to definitely challenge yourself and test yourself, because that's when your qualities will come out. And that hopefully will give you a different perspective on yourself. We've just had the instance where those boys in Thailand were rescued from being in the cave. And one of them, who was only 12, I think, talked about the importance of it in his life, his young life. Now that's going to give him a very different perspective, an important perspective, I would argue, on all things considering himself, working as a team, which will probably never leave him. And in some ways, here's a different perspective on that incident. That might have been a tremendous gift. A very strange way of looking at it, I know, because it seems like a tragedy. But it may be a tremendous gift in those boys' lives if they can take it into a positive place. And they certainly seem to have, you know, a really fantastic attitude about it.
Yeah, enduring a lot of struggle and kind of suffering. Coming out of that, you know, your perspective and your kind of, or you view things is definitely going to change. Surely that you can't go through something like that and it not change you in some way. So
Yeah.
if they're switched on, you can kind of do something positive about it, right?
Yeah.
Are there any good books that you'd recommend? Any Bono books or any other books about kind of perspective change and stuff?
Yeah,
you'd recommend?
I mean, we've talked about science fiction before, haven't we? And again, this is an area where that kind of speculative thought can change your perspective and help to change your perspective because it's creative. But I mean, that's a particular like of mine.
Yeah.
But there are many other things that you can do, and I do absolutely recommend going and getting the influences of art, whatever it is that you feel particularly strongly drawn to. Whether, you know, like yourself, John, it's quite based around music, for example. Then those different musical perspectives and influences are very, very important. If you like visual art, then again, go and suck up those influences. One of the things Bono talks about is even going into supermarkets with an idea of the problem that you have and then picking up a random object and seeing how that can help you with your problem. It seems crazy, it seems ridiculous, but that's going to make you think in so many different new ways when you do that. The use of lateral thinking is where that's outlined.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something which I recommend. Anything where you can gain a different person's view on something, which will challenge yours as well, is going to help to provoke a new way of thinking in you.
Excellent.
There's probably one more thing I'd like to say on that, and that's when you look particularly at religious examples, and I'm not specifying a particular one here, but for example, some of the sayings of the Buddha, of Jesus, that they can give you a new perspective because actually that's what they were designed to do.
Right.
Now I talked about humour as being the way that you can get from A to C when you expect to go to B, and then you can the asymmetry is what you work out. There's a great and undervalued thing in the parables of Jesus. So I mean, I know you're familiar with these stories from your upbringing, as am I. But what the stories are about, you know, whoever came up with them, that's a different podcast altogether. But what he does in those stories is he takes you along a narrative form, and then there's a twist in the tale. So, for example, in The Good Samaritan, the good man is the man who is the enemy of the Jews who'd be listening to it. Jesus himself being a Jew, of course. And that's not what was expected. So it forces them to think in a different perspective about loving your neighbour.
Right.
You know, and who is your neighbour? And then Jesus talks about the Samaritan. The Samaritan, you know, are mortal enemies. In The Prodigal Son, there's a huge twist in that tale when the son isn't rejected but is embraced at the end. Again, that's to take you into a new perspective.
Yeah.
It's not just in those tales, but most mythological forms often will have a twist. And the one which made me think of changing perspective a lot is that many young people will have a desire to travel. And one of the reasons for that, it seems to me, is an honest desire to grow and to, I guess the cliche is to find yourself.
Yeah.
But there's many mythological examples where you go on a huge travel looking for treasure, which usually signifies wisdom, only to find that all along it was buried next door.
Right.
You know, I think even Paulo Coelho in The Alchemist has that kind of mythological story. It's an old story, but you know, you can dress it up in many different ways. And that signifies in a way that what's changed is actually your perspective. And so it was there all along.
Yeah.
It was already there, but you almost needed to go on that travel in order to jump out of your normal perspective and come back and see the value in what you already had. This is an amazing thing where people go through experiences where their life is in danger. And even though their parents, loved ones, and all the rest of it were there all along, only then do they seem to come back and realise the actual value in it, that life is impermanent, etc., etc. And the real treasure is already around them in many ways. Again, that's a jump of perspective which has gone through challenge and the journey that you've gone on. If you find these videos useful, please like, subscribe and click the bell, and we'll keep the content coming. And you may want to check out my book, Awakening the Warrior, available on Amazon.